Welcome to Extra Takes, hosted by Northland Church Lead Pastor Dr. Joshua Laxton. Join us each week as Pastor Josh reveals the rest of the story behind his sermons. We'll discuss how those who follow Christ can live out a biblical vision for the church in our world today.
Well, hello, Northland family and friends. Welcome to another episode of Extra Takes. I'm coming to you live from New Smyrna Beach. The Laxtons, we've just gotten away just for a few days before really summer is over. I can't even believe it. The summer has flown by, but we're just getting a little R&R. And so I wanted still to do Extra Takes because I believe that this is a fun series that we're in, and definitely wanted to talk a little bit more about pain and suffering since it's such a relevant topic to many of us, if not all of us, as human beings. So obviously, you know my co-host, Matt. He is in the studio, and I myself, I am not. So, Matt, how you doing?
Good. I'm not at the beach, but I'm glad you are.
Isn't this your home? Isn't this like your home, like stomping grounds?
Yeah. I was born in New Smyrna.
Yeah.
My dad grew up there, and my parents live there now.
Okay. Now, do they live on the beach? Or do they live a little bit more inland?
They live on the mainland, but they're about 5 minutes from the beach, so
yeah,
not too bad. Yeah.
Good. They love it?
Oh, of course. Of course. It's the beach. What's not to love?
Listen, I know. Yeah. My wife loves the beach. Absolutely loves the beach. She could spend almost every day at the beach, and she would be great.
So my task today is to get us out in 46 minutes because you have vacation to do.
All right. Let's see.
Okay. We're going to do this?
Good goal.
All right. So we're in this A&E series, and this is New Song, Same Humanity. And the new song today was Benson Boone, and that was Beautiful Things. And this was July 20th and 21st. So let me go through the two main goals for the series, then I'll go through the outline, and then we will dig in. So your two main goals for the series is this will help you spiritually and biblically process the music you listen to. We all listen to music, so you really challenge us to want to help to process that well, spiritually and biblically. And then also this is allows us, hopefully equips us to missionally engage those in our sphere of influence, family, friends, coworkers, etc. Because whether we know or listen to these specific songs, these songs are so popular that it's very well possible that someone in our life does. And even if it's not this specific song, this is a great opportunity for us to practice with a very, very popular set of songs, how we might do this. And we're all kind of doing this together. Yeah. So for the outline, you started with the introduction again, which I thought was so great. This introduction of Daniel, and you said music is the cue for the culture to know when and who to bow down to, which I think is so very important for us to continue to kind of put in front of our minds of why we would even spend 4 weeks of a church calendar year focusing on songs that aren't Christian in nature, because these songs are really important to culture, and songs in general are so important to culture, and it's really helpful for us to know that. And then you dug into the song lyrics. Again, you said you came up with these 4 big buckets. You looked at the song lyrics like you would a passage, and you broke it down and circled words and looked at themes. And these 4 big buckets you came up with was acknowledgement of beautiful things, thankfulness of beautiful things, fear of losing beautiful things, and then an adulterous love of beautiful things. Also interesting, as we were going through these lyrics, then we immediately saw the story of Job jump out at us, right? It was hard not to hear that, and so that's where you went. You then broke down, spent a good chunk of your sermon breaking down Job, and then you looked at questions we may have and questions God has for us. You looked at 5 truths that Job had to embrace that allowed him to sing this song. And then finally, you ended with the greater Job is Jesus, which is very similar to how you ended the previous week with SZA and Saturn. So we end with Jesus. So what are some initial thoughts after this weekend of how this sermon went? And I know you always have expectations of this. It's probably a little different going through a sermon like this. So what are some initial thoughts?
I mean, a couple of things that I just wrote down in my notes that I never said during the message per se is that in his verse where he says, I found my mind, I'm feeling sane. It's been a while, but I'm finding my faith. And so if he's singing about his faith is good as long as he has beautiful things in his life.
Hmm.
So he's finding his faith now, and again, he's expressing this particular. Again, I think songs do express people's, their some essence of their faith. I think he's still wrestling with his.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm like, so when you take away beautiful things, I think his faith crumbles.
Hmm.
And I think there's a lot of truth to that in people's lives, is that depending on what your faith is in, if you have it and things are good, and then when you don't have it, that's when you fall, that's when you crumble. I mean, we see that even with Peter. I remember preaching a message about his faith. His faith is crumbling in the Garden of Gethsemane when the soldiers come and they want to arrest Jesus, and Peter takes out a sword and begins to slash at people and cuts off a guy's ear, and Jesus tells him to put the sword away, and then a few hours later he's denying Jesus. His faith is crumbling, and he doesn't know what to do, because Jesus, who is the object of Peter's faith, it wasn't that Jesus was crumbling. It was what Peter identified Jesus should be was crumbling.
Right.
And particularly here in this song, Beautiful Things, his faith is actually beautiful things, because another thing that, I wrote down is when he acknowledges beautiful things, he never acknowledges God as even a beautiful thing.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So he acknowledges God as the giver and taker of beautiful things, but he doesn't acknowledge God as even a beautiful thing. And I think, I think that's a downfall of humanity, is that we tend to look at God as, even if we see him as the giver and the taker, he's in some sense this genie that gives, and if we're not careful, he'll take away. But we'll never come to see him as the beautiful thing. So that's another thing that I would say is kind of is a takeaway that I have. Another thing that my children, they wanted me to know, is that I need to start pulling my metrics from Spotify and not YouTube, because downloads of just this song is like 1 billion on Spotify. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Oh, that is fascinating. I still go to YouTube as well.
I guess it's our those who are in their 40s go to YouTube. I guess those who are in their teens and maybe 20s go to Spotify. Like I don't listen to anything on Spotify. Like I listen to Amazon Music, because I get that through Prime. So I can get all of the new albums through there. But yeah,
it's funny. I do listen to Spotify, but if I'm looking at views, my default is YouTube. Fascinating. Yeah. So you mentioned, I don't know how deep of a dive you did on his life. Do we know his faith?
No, I didn't. I actually didn't do much of a dive on him. Now, I did make sure that he was in his early 20s, because I did mention I think he's in his early 20s at 22. The 11. He's 22. Yeah, he's 22. So I didn't do a deep dive into his background.
Yeah, it was hard to find. He had a little bit of background in the Mormon Church, and then I couldn't find. I just found some discussion around he became a non-denominational evangelical, but it's just an interesting thing to think about, because regardless, I mean, a couple of things. As an artist, I have an appreciation for their vulnerability,
Yeah.
right? And one of the things that um, can be so endearing is um, people will feel a connection to a song, and an artist puts into words what people are feeling that they might not even say out loud, right?
Yeah.
So I do think there's a lot, not just outside the church, but even in the church that could relate to what he was saying. But you open yourself up to this idea of we can critique without criticizing,
Yeah. I
and
mean,
and it's just an interesting thing for you to even say whether he's a believer or not. There are saying things about his theology that we can point out and learn from.
well, we it's something that I've always said in terms of cultural engagement is that whether it's movies, songs, they do act as a cultural anthropology that again peers into the soul of human beings as to what they're wrestling with, what they believe, what their hurts, habits, and hangups are. I mean, when I put that list there, that's a cultural anthropology. Is that they are expressing something about their humanness.
Yep.
Uh, what they believe is divine, what they don't believe. So and it is fascinating. And then when you listen to his song, and this is what somebody was interesting here in some of the comments afterwards, is that when they first when our Danny started to sing, and they had never heard that song, it appears to be a Christian song. And then you get into, and it's kind of like, oh, this is weird. And that's why I think it's important that we do things like this in the church, is that there are a lot of things that can appear to be good and expressing of our angst or even anger, and we would think that they might be Christian on the surface, but if you peel back the layers, okay, it actually isn't very biblical. It might be hints of some elements of Christian, like, so the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. There's beautiful things, but that's even why I needed to make sure that I was not in favor of his girlfriend coming over and staying the night. I mean, like, that is not something that the Bible would accept as okay behavior for followers of Jesus.
I thought that was such a wonderful example of the cultural nuance and the contextualization that has to happen when we dive into these waters. Because, right, like, when we're not used to that, our guards can be up, right? And we might just, whether we realize or not, have this critical spirit and just want to pick everything apart. Oh, since you're talking about this, you must be condoning this, right? And as you wade into those waters, you have to be very careful to say, hey, we don't condone this, right? So just the fact of talking about a song can sometimes kind of open us up to that. And it's so interesting you said that about people seemingly thinking it was a Christian song at first. I wrote down, I think we need to learn to be more discerning when someone references God. I think, think about this post-Christendom era, right? We're used to 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, someone mentions God, most of us, we're all aligned.
Yeah.
You know what they're talking about, but we can't assume that now, right? Like, we can't assume what God they're talking about. And even so, even if it is Yahweh, right, we have to make sure that the theology is not off. We can't just take them at their word.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes back to this idea that I don't think that that believers, Christians, ought to just listen to Christian songs. So that's, I think that even a song like Benson's, if somebody wanted to listen to it, I don't think that that's sin. Now, I do. It goes back to what I said when I was doing the introduction 2 weeks ago. I think you need to be able to discern what is right and wrong. And if you cannot discern what is right and wrong, or you don't have anybody to help you process or filter what is right and wrong, then I think you need to be beware of what you're listening to and what's coming into your life. I think I might, I'm struggling on how I'm going to structure this coming weeks, because I do think that I might even have to deal with a little bit more. Do we listen? When do we not listen to songs, or take kind of more of that introduction I did 2 weeks ago, and maybe give just a little bit more commentary on that.
Yeah.
Uh, because again, it's kind of like Benson's song, is that if you listen to it, I don't think there's anything wrong with listening to it. However, if you begin to buy into his belief, I do think that there's holes in his belief, which is why we're doing this series, is that let's unpack that, because he definitely mentions some things there that would definitely be in the scripture. We literally saw in Job, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. But Benson goes the direction of, I'm angry. I would be angry at God because he took away. Job goes the direction of praise.
Right.
And I think we need to know that. I think we need to know those things.
Yeah, it is. It's such a fine line to walk, because anything we consume affects us. Like
Yeah.
we can say we're going to be vigilant, but like that's a hard thing, especially if we're not used to it. That's a hard thing to like constantly be vigilant on what we're consuming. I mean, it's just a real big issue for us. You know,
Yeah. Well, and I definitely think, and if you look at the artists that we've done so far, I mean, they're all Gen Z kind of artists, maybe young millennials, maybe, but most 40, 50, plus years old, they've never heard of Benson. They never heard of SZA. But my kids, and then other kids, like we had some friends, they came on Saturday night, and the guys on staff actually at a church, at a local church, and he and his wife, they didn't know Benson, but his kids definitely knew Benson.
mm,
And I know that my daughter, she's like, I can't believe that you preached on SZA and I wasn't there. I was out of town. That's my favorite artist. And so my concern, and again, this is just another reason, just put this as another reason why we do it, is that our younger generation, if we don't know what they're listening to, if we cannot help them process what they're listening to, I would actually say shame on us. Because we come from, I come from a background that just said, well, just don't listen to anything, just listen to Christian music. I don't know if that's necessarily the right answer either. So that's why, like, I do believe that we need to help our students, our kids, process things that they're listening to, and then to also put up some good boundaries. But nevertheless, if we don't help them and we don't know, then I just don't know how well we can fully engage a culture, because they're going to listen to it. They are going to listen to it. And that goes back to the point that I made on Extra Takes last week, was that Daniel, and then particularly more specifically in Daniel 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had to listen to the entire song. They just weren't going to bow down. And I think that's part of it, is that it's okay to be in the culture. I just don't become of the culture. Is that you're going to know things. And again, I'm not given a license to do to sin. But if we don't, if we're not aware of things, if we're not aware of themes and trends in movies and in shows and in music, I don't know how well we're going to be able to communicate. I actually got, so this was a couple of years back when I was at Wheaton. I did an article entitled "We Need to Speak Pagan a Little Bit Better." Something, I forget the exact title, but we need to move from Christianese to being able to speak pagan, because we speak really good Christianese. But if we're going to be on mission as God has called us to be salt, light, to be missionaries in the culture, we're going to have to actually learn, more pagan kind of vernacular and language. And so people hammered me on that, and that's okay. But I actually stand by it. I think we need to learn pagan. Now, that doesn't mean to be pagan. That doesn't mean to participate in paganism. But I think we need to know the language of pagans.
Yeah.
Because if we don't, it's going to be hard to communicate. And again, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense when I'm talking about SZA or Benson or the artists that I'm going to be talking about this coming week. I'm just trying to deal with their lyrics, their language,
Yeah.
and help Christians wrestle with it, because there's millions of people listening to it. It's resonating with them, and we need to know how to engage well without when I say without condemning, as John 3 would say, they already stand condemned.
Hmm. I think that's a great example. The idea of, can we speak pagan without becoming pagan? That's really what we're talking about, is entering into it, being in the world and not of the world. I mean, it's the classic example of that. And it reminds me of, we've talked about different ways to engage culture. You are helping us live that out through these series.
Here's another example I remember, and this actually is in more of the church sphere.
Mm.
But I remember going to a conference. It's actually the conference I met Joni at, so almost 22 years ago. But it was called Shepherding the Sheep Conference.
Mm.
And that if you're going to be a pastor, you're going to have to be around sheep. And if you don't smell like sheep, then you probably haven't been among the sheep. And I think that that's part of the world, is part of being in the world but not of it, is that you're so around the world that in some sense you smell like the world, you just aren't the world. And I know that that's it can be a very blurry line, a very muddy line. But I mean, if you even think about Jesus's immersion into the kingdom of man, because that's, he left heaven, entered into planet Earth, entered into the realm of humanity. That was one of the issues that the religious leaders had with him. He in some sense was too ingrained within the kind of the common folk and even the sinful folk. So even his disciples had a hard time with him speaking to that woman, the Samaritan woman at the well. You had the Pharisees really having a fit when he's engaging an adulterous woman. They called him a friend of sinners. I mean, he was so in the world, but he wasn't of the world. And I think sometimes I think that there needs to be some of that boundary line that we push in this regard, and I'm trying to do it in a very hopefully tactful way, a spirit-filled way, to show people that there's a way to engage without succumbing to, but also to be lovingly, to be loving. When I say lovingly in our engagement,
Yeah. Well, so the first 3 weeks of this series, for a large portion of our congregation, I think it would be safe to say that many of us did not know these first 3 artists, but this last artist we'll all know. So,
yeah.
So you're pushing the envelope a little more.
And I did have some people come up to me and say, "Hey, is it going to be this person?" So I had to say, "Yeah."
Did everyone get it right?
Yeah.
I
mean, the handful of people that came up to me.
I had 2 people and they both got it right. They said, if it's not this person, I go, it's that person. Okay.
Yeah, and I was telling, I've on the way over here this morning, I was talking to the Laxton family about just how I say it's difficult. I just don't know which direction I'm going to go. I mean, and that because I'm not taking one song. That's the part that's the difficult part. It's not like I'm taking one song, so I don't. So yeah, I can't even tell you which direction I'm going to. I think I know what direction I probably should go, but I still don't know because it's yeah.
Because you could have done a whole series.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I could have done a whole series just on that person, alone and their music.
Similar to Hamilton last year, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what it's going to be. I mean, but this person is. I mean, they're huge. I mean, you take just the last 2 artists. I mean, this person. I mean, blows them out of the water in terms of.
Yeah.
When I say their capital, their social capital, their financial capital, and so now I'm giving you even more. So for those
Everybody
who
knows.
are listening,
Everybody knows.
like y'all would know, and if you don't, then I guess y'all. And
You need
they're
to engage culture more.
and they've shifted genres throughout their career.
Yeah.
So now the genre that they recently did isn't the genre they started out with, which it's fat, and then I would actually say that that's fascinating too, is that there's this evolution. See, that's what's making it a little complicated. There's this evolution
Mm.
to this person, and so yeah, and so I'm almost trying to do a deep dive into their life.
Mm.
So here's a way, I know that we're still talking about, we're supposed to be talking about Benson, but
Benson, sorry, Benson.
wrestling. We're having this conversation now because maybe you can help me out.
There you go.
Is It's almost as if there's an evolution where they're trying to find their identity, and that they're trying to find it in relationships. They're trying to find it in some sense, genres of music, and because it's interesting how and we're doing a medley next week, and when you look at just the beats per minute in terms of the songs, it gets lower and lower to her latest album.
Hmm.
I said her again, but I said her last week. But
slower.
So is it should I tackle it from an evolution of identity? That here's a person that they're trying to find who they are, and they're just they're actually expressing that through their music, through 20 years of music. And you're just seeing their journey of trying to find who they are, and then they're expressing their frustration that they haven't found it in the right person yet. They haven't found it in the right, whether it's a work relationship, they just haven't found it yet, and they're just expressing now this torment and frustration that they have felt now through all of these years of struggle.
In the power and the danger of that is she and other artists shepherd their followers. And she has been for decades, shepherding into a certain mindset. And as the twists and turns of finding yourself, that's where that's where the opportunity comes, as they are leaders, whether they realize it or not. I mean, they're leading culture, and they're thought leaders, and there's tons of influence, obviously.
Yeah. So and that's my kind of my struggle with this one is is okay. I'm not going to do a song. I'm almost trying to. This is kind of what I'm trying to do, and this is why it's a little hard, because I don't think I'm an expert in this, but if I'm interpreting all of this throughout the years, and it's interesting because I've used ChatGPT to say, give me a rundown of the evolution of this person over the last 20 years and their music. And it's interesting, again, ChatGPT will give me just a rundown.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if I'm trying to counsel. So I'm trying to put on a counselor's hat to go, okay, here's what I'm seeing. These are the patterns that I'm seeing. And you have such a large following. I want to help the culture process. Listen, I'm grateful that she's expressing all of these things, but if you don't want your evolution to be like hers, you need something deeper and more substantive. Almost.
Has there been a passage or passages that have come out of this process for you?
Well, if I just stuck on relationships, yeah, there's two particular passages, but I don't know which one I would want to do. If I'm going to drill down even further, it's going to be identity, and then there's so many different passages that I can go to Genesis like I always do, and then the book of Ephesians is all about identity. So it just really depends on which direction I feel like the Lord wanted me to go to try to because I almost think that I'm going to be speaking to the younger generation with this one.
I mean, You're speaking to millennials too.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. Yeah, but then I can also, I mean, I could
Because
be
millennials
speaking
grew
to
up with
those
her.
who are 40s and 50s that they've never. Because here's another thing: I question whether or not they've grown up, but they're trapped.
Mm.
They're trapped in a younger pattern that, again, I don't know if they've grown up. And I think there's a lot of 40, 50-year olds, they've never grown up. They've been trapped into a pattern of their past. And while they have aged, their mindset and their, in some sense, see, this is where I know, I'm almost hesitant to even say, but it's almost like I think they're trapped. And I do think that there are a lot of people that they've been trapped by things that they did earlier in life.
Mm.
And now they're just expressing now frustration from a poor pattern of living that they've never broke.
Mm.
I mean, this is why it's just a little challenging, because I'm like, man, I probably should have just took a song and not like almost like a medley. Now the medley that we're doing is all about relationships, so maybe I stick with just the relationship part, but I don't know, man.
Go with that direction.
So the
Go with that
relationship.
direction. Yeah. Yeah. That's always been the common thread for me as I listen to her music. All right, let's get back to Benson. We got to give him his due time.
Give him his due. All
Well,
right.
we got to get to Job actually, because Job's who we want to profile here, don't we? You had talked about four big buckets for his song, Benson's song: acknowledgement, thankfulness, fear, and idolatrous love. You said the main takeaway from the song was he's so worried about losing the beautiful things in life that he's failed to realize and embrace the most beautiful thing in the world, God. That is interesting because, yeah, he acknowledges the beautiful things, but that acknowledgement was family, girl, love, and good feelings. And when you even look at the lyrics, he kind of goes back and forth from he's talking to us for a bit, then he's talking to his girl, then he's talking to God, right? So he's talking to each of us and he kind of flips back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But I didn't realize until you just said that he never actually acknowledges to God his beautiful thing. He just acknowledges his power. So although there's this fear, there seems to be maybe a lack of relationship.
Yeah, I would actually go back to Genesis 11. A few weeks ago I talked about how the kingdom of man in Genesis 11, as they're building their city, they're building a tower, a temple reaching to the heavens to appease the gods in order for them to pursue their own glory. And really throughout human history, that's how human beings have treated religion. They have treated religion as if we can just appease the god or the gods, then we can pursue our own glory. And that does seem to me what Benson is doing, is that if he could just kind of tip his hat to God, acknowledge God, like, hey, I see you there. I realize how powerful you are. I actually don't recognize your beauty. I actually don't recognize your glory. I don't, he recognizes none of those things. He recognizes, in some sense, the divinity element of God, in some sense, the largeness of him, but he does not acknowledge the beauty and the glory of God, and therefore worship him as he is most worthy of. And so it goes back to Genesis 11 for me with what Benson is doing.
Yeah. Yeah, he knows God, but he doesn't know God.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's move on to Job. Something that stuck out to me, you talked about Job's stellar faith, but you kind of had this clarification that his stellar faith doesn't mean he didn't hurt, doesn't mean he didn't grieve, didn't vent, didn't question, didn't doubt. Man, there's so much there, and it's so important for us to hear that. That he wasn't, it's like he wasn't removing all of his emotions. He was still being human in that moment, right? Like he was still somehow he was practicing faith, um, but the emotions were still there. Which of those stood out to you, or which of those do you want to dive into more?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of them do because I've seen anytime I've talked with someone about their pain, their suffering,
Mm,
I think it just depends on the person. But you know,
yeah.
and it's not that I would say that this is a process. I think it kind of just is predicated on what you're going through. Do you hurt? Do you grieve? Are you venting? You know, venting kind of goes around anger, but again, anger is I think the first stage of grief.
Mm,
So, and all of that, and I actually believe that. I mean, God is okay with those things. I mean, we see that with Job. I mean, he's hurting because he does not understand at all. And
mm,
obviously, he and his wife are grieving. And I don't know if because they lost so much. I mean, are they grieving the money that they lost, or are they grieving the children that they lost? Because in some sense, you can, in some sense, recoup money. You can't recoup children.
mm,
And so there's that grief there. The questioning is like, you know, he's trying to search because he knows, like his three friends say Job, because they have a very limited theology, and their limited theology would say, Job, you wouldn't be going through this unless you have some kind of hidden sin in your life. And if you didn't have a hidden sin, maybe your children did, because
yeah.
that's why you're going through all of this. And so Job is even like, God, like, man, if there was something, I don't think there's anything in me. That's the reason why, you know, when he's saying, though he slay me, I will hope in him,
Yeah.
because it's like, man, I really am. I'm blamed. Like I've introspectively looked at my life, and I don't see anything bad. Like, and it's not that he's perfect, and that's why I wanted to really draw the distinction between Job and Jesus, is that he's
Mm,
blameless in the sense that he is a godly man in right standing with the Lord, not meaning that he's perfect. But nevertheless, he's questioning God. Why would you allow? Like, all I wanted to do was serve you. All I do is serve you. So that's where I just want to give people a license to do
mm,
this without feeling like they've sinned. Because in all of that, Job maintained his integrity. Although he hurt, he grieved, he vented, he questioned, and he wrestled with doubt.
mm, mm. I thought it was so interesting that you said God can't handle our questions, and then you gave us a zinger. Can we handle His? That's kind of the next. I feel like that's like the next step of spiritual maturity. You know, first of all, getting to the point of us being comfortable with lobbing really deep questions with God and feeling like confident that He can handle it. But it's a whole nother level to you know consider what questions He might ask us.
That he speaks to Job from the whirlwind. Because I mean, that's what pain and suffering feel like, a whirlwind
Mm, mm.
with thunder.
What was the example you gave about the what animal giving birth? What was that?
The mountain goat.
Mountain goat.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a funny one.
Yeah, I mean,
He's
well, then he talks about the ugliness of an ostrich. Like, where you did you consult me, Job, on how I designed the ugliness of the ostrich? No, you didn't. I mean, it is. It's interesting, but he's actually going to go through creation, basically.
mm, mm,
He's going to start big and even move to
mm.
granular. Like, did you tell the oceans that you can only come this far?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
set
And
boundaries.
I think it just does, those big questions just do such a good job of putting things into perspective because um there are questions we can ask that are hard, that are hard to answer, but how much harder, when we realize that we are infinitely we are finite, all right, and he is infinite. We are the created and he is the creator. And all of those questions, just like all it would take is one of those questions to just put all of us in line. But
Yeah. Well, I think another big takeaway for me is Satan's role is that, he believes, and in some sense rightfully so. I mean, that is the pattern of most human beings, is that
Hmm.
if you take away their beautiful things, they're not going to worship you, God. They're actually going to be ticked off at you. They're going to be very angry, and they're going to distance themselves from
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Yet Job completely throws him for a loop, and I actually think that that's what followers of Jesus, that's what Christians ought, they ought to throw Satan for a loop. And when you connect it to what happened in the garden, is that, hey, God told you not to touch this beautiful thing because He's holding out on you. So they take the beautiful thing in chaos, and if
Right.
we begin to worship beautiful things rather than the beautiful one, then our life is chaotic. I mean, you see that with Benson's song. It is a chaotic song
Yeah.
because he doesn't want to lose beautiful things. And in some sense, human beings, the fall surrounded the taking of beautiful things, and then chaos still reigns when we want to worship beautiful things. And what Job teaches us is that even when we lose beautiful things, we can hurt, we can grieve, we can do all those things, but as long as we maintain our integrity to worship God as the ultimate beautiful one, we will always maintain that integrity and that calmness even in the midst of chaos.
Mm.
And that is difficult. As actually, it's yeah. I want to say quite impossible, and the only possibility of it is by keeping our focus, being filled with the Spirit of God on Jesus as our King.
Yeah.
And through those five, and how you do that is through those five truths. Like,
Right.
so when you look at Benson, and you start looking at what he's saying in light of those five truths, so you look at hope, redemption, refinement, limitation, and restoration. All right, there's only one bucket that actually would coincide with Benson, and it's actually hope. He hopes that
Mm.
God doesn't take away beautiful things, but if he did lose beautiful things, he crumbles. Like, so there is no redemption for him, at least in his song.
Mm.
There is no refining that, hey, if he loses these beautiful things, man, then there's this process of him becoming better. It's his process of becoming, whether it's great, there's no refining. There's crumbling when that happens. And then when you look at limitation, he doesn't, he doesn't even want to acknowledge the limitation. I think he does. I think he does acknowledge his limitation of his inability to keep beautiful things, but he doesn't acknowledge his limitation of wisdom and understanding compared to the infinite wisdom and understanding of God. So again, he doesn't have a framework for that. And then of restoration, like, I really wish I had more time in that message, because I would have loved to have dealt, kind of dealt with more of the restoration of really what we're looking at. We may not fully be restored like
Yeah.
Job was, but there are some people that actually believe that he gives us a picture of the restoration of all things, of
Mm.
new creation. And wish I would have had a little bit more time to really kind of dive into, where Jesus truly is the greater Job. Because what I really wanted to, the one thing that I wish I could have just spent just a few moments on, was the fact that our God, our King, experienced pain and suffering. So here, Benson doesn't even acknowledge the fact that God has
Mm.
also experienced pain and suffering. He has experienced, I mean, I mentioned in the summary statement, is that God gave up his one and only beautiful thing. He lost his beautiful thing
Mm.
to
Mm.
save beautiful things. Like, in some sense, we were not ultimate. He was ultimate.
Mm.
His son, because again, you have to understand, Scripture teaches that we serve one God, three persons. So one God, Trinitarian God, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. God the Father is going to give up God the Son
Mm.
as a sacrifice for the sin. So God the Son will take upon himself the penalty of our sin, the pain and the punishment and the wrath for our sin. And that's why the book of Hebrews will talk about how we have a high priest. We now have an advocate. He's been through everything that a human being would go through, yet he has not sinned.
Mm.
And so I think that is lost on us as Christians too, is that when we go through that, that severe testing of pain and suffering, know that our King has gone through it too. That's why he's sweating drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. He knows what's coming down the pipeline. He knows pain is coming. He knows that suffering. He knows that separation from the Father is coming. Which again, that is part of that divine mystery and the infinite mystery that will never like. How does that even? I don't think we again have categories. We know that here's what the Bible says, but how is this? My God, why have you forsaken me? Like, so our King went through the ultimate torment so that we might ultimately be healed. Like, so again, Benson's song doesn't even have that framework, and that's how we're restored. That is restoration. And so that's where this pain, this suffering that we go through, it is a light and momentary affliction. It's a light and momentary pain, light and momentary. I mean, think about what Paul is saying is that what Job went through was light and momentary. In the surpassing worth of knowing the eternal weight of glory that is coming.
Remarkable. Wow.
And I've said this before, to Northland when we've talked about pain and suffering before, is that I actually believe that pain and suffering is a huge missional bucket of how we are salt and light, ambassadors and witnesses to the world, because the world is always going to sing songs like Benson, but we have to, and I believe that we are called to sing songs like Job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Naked I came into the world, and naked I will leave from the world. The Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name. May the name of the Lord be praised. The world cannot understand that. But the reason why it cannot understand it is that it doesn't have the frameworks of hope, of redemption, of refinement, of limitation, and of restoration. And that if we can hold those truths during our dark night of the soul, we will come out like Job. And that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean it's not going to hurt like hell. Doesn't mean that there won't be the stages of grief. Doesn't mean that you're not going to vent along the way. Doesn't mean that you don't have questions. It doesn't mean that you won't ever doubt. That's actually, going back to the whole, doubting, and watching The Chosen and this season and season 4. I don't know how I really feel about it, but I mean, I see what Dallas Jenkins is doing in writing a loss in Thomas's life and how that loss has contributed to his doubting of who Jesus is. And he's kind of angry at Jesus that you didn't save who he loved.
Wow.
You didn't come through for me, Jesus, but you came through for other people. I mean, and so he has his journey. And so again, we all are going to have our journey, but at the end of the day, I do believe that the Bible calls God's people to walk through it like Job, come out like Job, so that we maintain our distinctiveness from the world of how we would encounter and go through pain and suffering.
Amen.
So, is it a good place to end on?
I think so. Yeah.
All right. Well, until next time, Northland family and friends, have a wonderful week, and we cannot wait to worship King Jesus with you as we conclude our A&E series. New songs, same humanity, this coming weekend. So until then, blessings.
Thanks for listening to Extra Takes. Be sure to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so you won't miss a single episode.